They did not understand it at first, not the scale of the disaster, not the fragility of their position, and certainly not how close the Pacific War came to collapsing around the United States in 1942. But the shock arrived one carrier at a time, each loss carving away another layer of American naval strength until the Pacific Fleet was fighting with what seemed like the last of its breath. The crisis began in May at the Battle of the Coral Sea, when USS Lexington, one of only 3 American fleet carriers in the Pacific, absorbed multiple bomb and torpedo hits before a catastrophic gasoline vapor explosion sealed her fate. The Lady Lex, a symbol of American power projection, burned until her crew abandoned ship, and her sinking marked the first great U.S. carrier loss of the war. No one yet realized that it was only the beginning. 4 months later, the carrier that had struck the first American blow of the war, USS Wasp, was patrolling south of Guadalcanal when the Japanese submarine I-19 fired one of the most destructive spreads of torpedoes in naval history. 3 torpedoes slammed into Wasp, touching off infernos that raged uncontrollably through her hangar deck. Ammunition cooked off, aviation fuel lines burst, and in less than an hour, the carrier that had launched fighters for the hard-pressed Marines on Guadalcanal became an immobile, burning hulk. Her crew abandoned her to the flames. Shortly after, she slipped beneath the waves. The loss might have been survivable had it ended there, but fate had one more blow prepared. On October 26, 1942, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, USS Hornet, the last of the 3 Yorktown-class carriers, became the focus of a relentless Japanese air assault. Bombs smashed into her flight deck, torpedoes tore open her hull, and crashing Japanese dive bombers ignited fires across her hangar spaces. Though her crew fought desperately to save her, damage accumulated faster than control teams could respond. Eventually, Hornet was left dead in the water, listing and burning. American destroyers attempted to scuttle her when tow attempts failed, but she refused to sink until Japanese destroyers arrived and finished the job. With Hornet gone and Wasp already on the bottom, the U.S. Navy found itself at a moment of existential danger. In the span of 6 months, America had lost 3 major carriers, Lexington, Wasp, and Hornet, and the remaining carriers, Enterprise and Saratoga, had both suffered heavy damage in repeated battles. Enterprise spent significant periods in repair docks after the battles of Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz. Saratoga had been torpedoed in January and again in August. For days at a time, the entire Pacific War rested on a single operational American carrier. Japan, by contrast, still possessed Shokaku and Zuikaku, along with several light carriers. Their carrier air groups, though bloodied at Midway, remained lethal. They had shown at Santa Cruz that they could still deliver devastating coordinated strikes. In theory, and many American officers privately feared in practice, Japan now had a window of opportunity to wipe out the remaining U.S. carrier strength and force the United States onto the strategic defensive. Yet, the U.S. Navy did not collapse. It could not. The Marines on Guadalcanal were hanging on by their fingernails. The supply line through the South Pacific was fragile, and American prestige depended on holding the line. Instead of folding, the Navy absorbed each blow in improvised solutions. Pilots were shuffled between depleted squadrons. Enterprise limped from one battle to the next, patched in port and sent out again before repairs were complete. Carrier task forces operated more cautiously, yet more aggressively when needed, fighting to maintain control of the seas around Guadalcanal. Sailors joked grimly that the Pacific Fleet had become the one-ship navy, but beneath the humor was a sobering truth. The United States was surviving the carrier crisis only because one ship after another refused to die, and because the Navy, even wounded, refused to yield. What no one outside the highest command levels fully grasped yet was that America possessed 2 advantages Japan could not match: a repair system capable of turning shattered ships into combat-ready vessels with astonishing speed, and an industrial machine already building the carriers that would replace every loss. But in 1942, these advantages were still only a promise. In the moment, amid burning decks, smoke-filled skies, and desperate last stands, the question was painfully simple. How much more could the U.S. Navy endure before the Pacific slipped away for good? In the final months of 1942, many American commanders understood, though few dared to say it aloud, that the United States Navy was living on borrowed time. By every traditional measure of naval warfare, the U.S. should have collapsed under the pressure of its carrier losses. Japan, even after Midway, still possessed a functioning carrier force with trained aviators, combat-tested doctrine, and ships that remained operational. The Americans, by contrast, were down to a single fully active fleet carrier at several points, their air groups reduced in strength, their pilots exhausted, and their margin for error non-existent. To understand how perilous the situation truly was, one must look at the balance of forces as it existed at the end of 1942. Japan had entered the war with the world's finest naval aviation arm, highly trained air crews who had developed coordinated strike tactics during extensive operations in China, modern aircraft like the A6M0, and superb carrier doctrine emphasizing aggressive, long-range attacks. Although Midway destroyed 4 of their frontline carriers, the Japanese retained Shokaku and Zuikaku, 2 of the most advanced fleet carriers afloat, both protected by disciplined destroyer screens and still capable of launching large, coordinated strikes. Alongside them sailed light carriers such as Zuiho, which could absorb losses and keep Japanese naval aviation in the fight. By contrast, the U.S. Pacific Fleet in late 1942 relied almost entirely on Enterprise, often damaged, and Saratoga, which alternated between frontline duty and extended repairs after repeated torpedo hits. The loss of Hornet at Santa Cruz deprived the U.S. of its last undamaged Yorktown-class carrier. Worse, the air groups that once filled American flight decks had been depleted by continuous combat. At Coral Sea, Midway, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz, the U.S. lost dozens of their most experienced dive bomber crews and fighter pilots. The replacement pipeline could not produce combat-ready aviators fast enough. Japan still trained pilots through a rigorous multi-year program, while the U.S. was forced to rely increasingly on newer aviators with fewer flight hours and far less carrier landing experience. Equipment deficiencies compounded these problems. The F-4F Wildcat, though rugged and reliable, could not match the Zero in climb rate, sustained turn, or acceleration. The TBD Devastator torpedo bomber had already proven obsolete at Midway, and although the TBF Avenger represented an improvement, its early combat record was uneven. The SBD Dauntless remained America's most effective strike aircraft, but the loss of experienced SBD crews reduced its effectiveness in coordinated attacks. Even carrier defenses were strained. The U.S. Navy's early radar systems, though improving, were not always reliable, and fighter direction officers were still learning to guide defending fighters efficiently. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes repeatedly broke through these defenses, as seen in the attacks that crippled Enterprise at Santa Cruz and torpedoed Saratoga off Guadalcanal. Fuel shortages and logistics problems made matters worse. With few carriers remaining, each battle risked catastrophic losses. Task Force 61 often operated with minimal destroyer screens, stretching the defenses dangerously thin. Japanese commanders understood the strategic moment and believed, with reason, that one decisive victory could eliminate American carrier aviation entirely. The United States, reeling from 3 carrier losses in 1 year, looked vulnerable in a way few nations could withstand. Yet despite this imbalance, Japan failed to capitalize on its advantage. Their pilot losses at Midway and Santa Cruz, though smaller in absolute terms, were devastating to an elite force that could not easily replace them. Their carriers required yard time that Japan's limited industrial base struggled to provide. Their doctrines still assumed the availability of veteran air crews capable of executing complex multi-wave attacks, but by late 1942, many of those veterans were already gone. Meanwhile, the Americans were building something Japan could not counter, an industrial war machine capable of producing carriers, aircraft, and aviators in overwhelming numbers. But in 1942, this industrial surge was still a distant promise. On the front lines, every day seemed precarious. Every torpedo hit on Enterprise or Saratoga threatened to unravel the entire Pacific strategy. Every Japanese raid aimed not just to sink a ship, but to eliminate the last American carrier standing between them and victory. The U.S. Navy should have collapsed under the weight of these losses. On paper, there was no reason for the Americans to remain in the fight. But what saved them was not luck or happenstance. It was the extraordinary resilience of the ships still afloat, the speed at which American repair crews restored damaged carriers, and the industrial heartbeat of a nation preparing to flood the Pacific with the greatest carrier force the world had ever seen. The crisis was real, the threat overwhelming, and the margin for survival razor-thin. That the U.S. Navy endured it at all was nothing short of remarkable. If the United States Navy survived the catastrophic carrier losses of 1942, it was not because it had more ships, more pilots, or more luck. It survived because no Navy in history had ever repaired combat damage as fast, as aggressively, or as efficiently as the Americans did. In a war where a single operational carrier could decide the fate of entire campaigns, the U.S. Navy learned to rebuild shattered ships in days rather than months, and nowhere was this miracle more dramatically demonstrated than in the story of USS Yorktown. Yorktown had already endured brutal punishment at the Battle of the Coral Sea. She was hit by an armor-piercing bomb that tore through multiple decks, buckled bulkheads, and crippled her boilers. Naval engineers estimated that full repairs would require 3 months in dry dock. Instead, Yorktown steamed into Pearl Harbor, and American repair crews, shipfitters, welders, electricians, riggers, machinists, went to work around the clock. They rebuilt her flight deck, patched her hull, restored her boilers, and rearmed her strike groups in a breathtaking 72 hours. When Yorktown sailed back to sea on May 30, 1942, she was not fully repaired, but she was battle-ready, and she would play the decisive role in the Battle of Midway. No other navy in the world could have done this, and Yorktown was not the last ship to be resurrected by American industrial ingenuity. The USS Enterprise, the most battle-hardened carrier of the Pacific War, suffered severe damage at the battles of the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz. Bombs tore open her flight deck, destroyed elevators, ruptured fuel lines, and killed dozens. Each time, Enterprise limped back to Pearl Harbor or Noumea. Each time, repair crews patched her up in record time. After Santa Cruz, she arrived at Noumea with gaping holes in her deck and smoke-blackened hangar spaces. Instead of withdrawing her to the U.S. West Coast for major repairs, technicians worked non-stop, welding steel plates over shattered beams, clearing wreckage, and restoring aviation fuel lines. In just a few weeks, Enterprise, still scorched, still bearing the scars of battle, returned to the fight because she had to. For stretches of late 1942, she was the only operational American fleet carrier in the Pacific. The Navy could not afford to lose her. USS Saratoga faced a similar pattern. Torpedoed in January 1942, and again in August, she suffered flooding, power outages, and machinery damage that might have sidelined her for months. Yet, the repair yards at Pearl Harbor and San Diego restored her in a fraction of that time, enabling her to rejoin operations supporting the Guadalcanal campaign. This cycle of damage, repair, and return became the heartbeat of America's early war naval survival. It was made possible by a vast, coordinated network of shipyards: Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, Mare Island, Puget Sound, Bremerton, Hunters Point, all working at wartime tempo. These facilities were not merely fixing ships, they were conducting industrial resurrections under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The difference between American and Japanese repair philosophy was stark. When Japanese carriers like Shokaku or Zuikaku sustained significant damage at Coral Sea or the Eastern Solomons, they required months of yard time at Yokosuka or Kure. Japan had fewer dry docks, fewer trained repair specialists, and a rigid maintenance pipeline. A damaged Japanese carrier was essentially removed from the war for an entire season. The United States, by contrast, had built a system designed to keep ships on the front line. If a carrier could float, she could be repaired. If she could sail, she could return to combat. The industrial base behind these repairs was staggering. Steel mills producing plate around the clock, electrical plants manufacturing wiring and generators in bulk, machine shops turning out pumps, valves, and flight deck fittings by the thousands. Even more remarkable was the Navy's ability to move skilled repair crews forward. At Espiritu Santo, Noumea, and even Guadalcanal, advanced base repair units set up makeshift workshops capable of fixing cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels. For carriers, the main hubs remained Pearl Harbor and West Coast yards, but the speed at which they worked meant the front line was never left unsupported for long. The miracle of repair was not glamorous. There were no dramatic battle scenes, no epic carrier duels. Instead, it was a symphony of sparks from blowtorches, the clang of steel plates being riveted, the grind of winches lifting replacement beams into place. It was thousands of men laboring in heat, grease, and exhaustion so that ships could return to fight battles that would decide the war. Without this ability, without Yorktown's resurrection, without Enterprise's repeated returns from the brink, without the industrial pulse that kept Saratoga alive, the U.S. Navy would not have had a carrier force at all by the end of 1942. The Japanese believed they had dealt fatal blows that year. What they didn't understand was that America had built an army of repairmen behind every ship, a second navy of welders and engineers who ensured that no loss, no damage, and no disaster would be the end of the fight. Even as the United States Navy fought desperately through 1942, patching Enterprise, resurrecting Saratoga, and pushing every surviving carrier into battle, another force was gathering behind the scenes, vast and irresistible. It was not a fleet that yet existed on the open ocean, nor a formation that could be photographed by reconnaissance planes. It was the industrial might of the United States. Shipyards, steel mills, factories, foundries, and assembly lines, slowly building the ships that would not only replace the lost Lexington, Wasp, and Hornet, but would render those losses strategically irrelevant. The centerpiece of this industrial salvation was the Essex-class carrier. Conceived before the war, but accelerated dramatically after Pearl Harbor, the Essex-class represented a new generation of American naval aviation. Larger, tougher, faster to build, easier to maintain, and far more capable than any carrier afloat in 1942. These ships embodied lessons learned from every battle America had fought in the Pacific. The Essex-class featured a long, wide flight deck optimized for high-tempo operations, an armored hangar deck offering superior survivability, powerful deck-edge elevators that sped up aircraft movement, and advanced radar systems integrated into their combat information centers. More importantly, they were designed for mass production. Unlike Japan, which could produce only a handful of large carriers during the entire war, the United States planned and achieved construction on a scale unmatched by any navy in history. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. commissioned 24 Essex-class carriers, a carrier armada so immense that no Axis nation could hope to equal it. But in the dark days of late 1942, these ships existed only as blueprints, rivets, and hull sections, rising slowly from shipyard slipways. Their promise, however, was already reshaping American strategy. The Navy knew that once the Essexes arrived, the carrier shortage would end forever. Until then, every battered ship still afloat had to be preserved at any cost. The industrial miracle extended beyond the Essexes. The United States also commissioned Independence-class light carriers, 9 fast, agile ships converted from Cleveland-class cruiser hulls. These smaller carriers could not replace a fleet carrier in raw striking power, but they added invaluable aviation capacity during the crisis. Their construction time was extraordinarily short, less than 2 years from keel laying to commissioning. While the Essexes represented long-term superiority, the Independence-class carriers were the bridge that kept American carrier aviation alive during 1943. Together, the two classes formed a dual-pronged assault on Japan's naval limitations: light carriers to fill the immediate gap, and fleet carriers to dominate the future. Japan had no answer. After the catastrophic losses at Midway, Japan attempted to accelerate carrier construction, but their shipbuilding infrastructure and available workforce simply could not match American capacity. The Imperial Navy managed to complete only a few fleet carriers after 1942, Taiho, Unru, and Amagi, and none in numbers or speed sufficient to replace their losses or challenge American production. Worse for Japan, their aircrew training pipeline could not replenish veteran pilots at the pace necessary to fill new flight decks. By contrast, American naval aviation exploded explosively. New training programs, new bases, and new aircraft flowed from U.S. factories, providing pilots for the carriers still fighting and those being assembled.
The Essex-class was built to operate the next generation of American aircraft, the F-6F Hellcat, the SB-2C Helldiver, and later the TBM Avenger, aircraft designed specifically to counter Japanese capabilities. By mid-1943, the United States could begin realigning strategy. Instead of merely surviving, the Navy was preparing for dominance. As hull after hull reached the outfitting phase at Newport News, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Philadelphia, Quincy, and Brooklyn, admirals understood that a tidal wave of American carriers would soon surge across the Pacific. The contrast with Japan was stark. Where Japanese shipyards were slow, vulnerable to supply shortages, and limited in scale, American shipyards ran at full capacity day and night. Where Japanese industry struggled to construct a single large carrier in the time available, the United States launched multiple Essex-class hulls concurrently. And while the Japanese Navy waited years for replacements it could not afford, the U.S. Navy was preparing for an era when carriers would be abundant, not scarce. The carrier crisis of 1942 was real, and for a time it threatened the entire Pacific campaign. But once the Essex-class began sliding down the slipways, the crisis was effectively over, even if the Japanese did not yet realize it. America was about to unleash the largest, most powerful carrier force ever assembled. The losses of Lexington, Wasp, and Hornet were no longer fatal. They had become a prelude to overwhelming strength.
By the end of 1943, the United States Navy was no longer the wounded force that had staggered through the disasters of 1942. It was becoming something entirely different, a carrier-powered machine of overwhelming scale, rebuilt with fresh ships, revitalized with new aircraft, and manned by a rapidly expanding corps of trained aviators who would soon sweep across the Pacific in numbers Japan could not even begin to match. The transformation was so dramatic that within a single year, the Navy shifted from desperate survival to absolute dominance. At the heart of this rebirth stood the carriers themselves. The arrival of the first Essex-class ships, USS Essex, Yorktown CV-10, and Intrepid, marked the beginning of a new American era at sea. These carriers operated more aircraft, absorbed more damage, and launched more sorties than anything Japan had ever faced. They were armored, spacious, and designed for relentless operations. Japan's carrier doctrine centered on delivering a single crushing blow. America's new carriers were built for sustained power projection, continuous sorties, all-weather attacks, and long-range operations, supported by industrial supply chains that ensured they never lacked aircraft, spare parts, or fuel. At the same time, the aircraft flying from American decks underwent a revolution. In early 1942, the U.S. Navy fought with Wildcats and Devastators, brave aircraft, but outmatched in performance. By late 1943, the new generation had arrived. The F-6F Hellcat, a rugged, powerful fighter, proved superior to the Zero in speed, climb, dive, durability, and firepower. Within a year, Hellcat pilots would claim over 5,000 aerial victories, earning the reputation of being the Zero's executioner. The TBF Avenger, armed with radar and heavier ordnance, matured into the Navy's standard torpedo bomber. The SB-2C Helldiver, though initially plagued with issues, eventually replaced the SBD Dauntless and delivered heavier bomb loads with greater range. These aircraft transformed the carriers from vulnerable, precious assets into instruments of offensive might. They gave the U.S. Navy reach, striking power, and survivability Japan could not counter. This aerial transformation was matched by a profound shift in pilot training. Before the war, naval aviators underwent a slow, elite process that produced small numbers of highly skilled pilots. After 1942, the United States built an aviation training pipeline unmatched in history. New airfields, carrier qualification programs, and advanced flight schools designed to produce thousands of proficient aviators every year. Unlike Japan, whose veteran losses at Midway and Santa Cruz crippled their air groups, the U.S. Navy could replace pilots rapidly while improving instructional methods. By 1944, American carriers sailed with fresh, well-trained aircrews, while Japan struggled to field pilots with even basic qualifications. Another decisive change was the rise of radar-directed operations. American carriers now sailed with integrated CICs, fighter direction officers, and radar-equipped aircraft. This meant U.S. carriers could detect incoming raids long before they arrived, scramble interceptors with precision, and guide them into ideal attack positions, something the Japanese Navy never fully mastered. Radar turned the night from a vulnerability into an advantage. Night fighters like the F-4U Corsair and radar-equipped Adventures began patrolling darkness that had once belonged exclusively to the Japanese. Carrier task forces known to operate continuously, day and night, transforming naval aviation from a once or twice per day weapon into a 24-hour instrument of war. As Essex-class carriers multiplied, they formed task groups, then task forces, each capable of independent operations. By late 1943, the U.S. Navy no longer relied on one or two carriers at a time. It deployed them in groups of 4, 5, or 6, each escorted by fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The Japanese Navy, which had once dominated the Pacific with 6 carriers at Pearl Harbor, now found itself facing carrier formations 2 or 3 times that size.
The shift was not merely numerical, it was doctrinal. American carrier warfare had evolved into a coordinated, radar-driven system of strikes, defenses, and logistics that Japan could not disrupt or replicate. When the Fast Carrier Task Force began operations against the Marshalls and the Marianas in 1944, it became clear that the carrier crisis of 1942 was long over. The U.S. Navy now fielded a carrier force so large, so well-trained, and so technologically advanced that Japan's remaining carriers could not hope to challenge it. The losses of Lexington, Wasp, and Hornet had once seemed like wounds that might never heal. Instead, they became catalysts, lessons written in fire that shaped the Navy's rebirth. In their place rose the mightiest carrier fleet the world had ever seen, a symbol of American resilience and industrial supremacy. What began as disaster had become dominance. And as the Essex-class swept across the Pacific, island by island, airfield by airfield, the U.S. Navy proved that the true measure of power was not how many ships were lost, but how a nation rebuilt, rearmed, and returned to fight stronger than before.